Dominic Cummings has declared war on Boris Johnson, accusing him and his office of falling so far below the standards of competence and integrity the country deserves. Just a bitter man, or a man who could bring down the Prime Minister? We'll be asking how much damage accusations of sleaze and this angry explosion could do to Boris Johnson. Also tonight, is it now time for the rich countries to send vaccine supplies around the world, if only in the name of enlightened self-interest? Good evening. Dominic Cummings has come out all guns blazing tonight, attacking the Prime Minister by questioning his competence and integrity. It's a remarkable intervention from his former advisor, whom Boris Johnson failed to sack after his infamous trip from London to Barnard Castle during the first lockdown. The attack came after headlines this morning quoting a Number 10 source, claiming that Boris Johnson believes Cummings was behind the leaking of texts between the Prime Minister and James Dyson over tax affairs. In fact, Dominic Cummings makes a series of extremely serious allegations for which he says he has proof. A subsequent statement from Number 10 asserts that at all times, government and ministers have acted in accordance with the appropriate codes of conduct and electoral law. The question is, will all this cast a pall over the Tory vote in the forthcoming elections, which are less than 2 weeks away? Here's our policy editor, Lewis Goodall, and his report does contain some flashing images.
It's been a week about hushed whispers about who said what to whom and when. It ends with a political conflict which is very, very noisy. A tale which may just be beginning. Last night, Downing Street briefed that the Prime Minister believed that Dominic Cummings was responsible for the leaks of his text messages with James Dyson, as well as for previous leaks, including over lockdowns last year.
Have you and other ministers broken the rules, Prime Minister?
If it was an attempt to move the story on from uncomfortable territory around Johnson's conversations with Dyson, then it has spectacularly backfired. In a sensational and unusually pithy blog post published this afternoon, Cummings makes a series of extremely serious allegations about the Prime Minister and his Number 10 operation. First of all, with regards to the leak, Cummings said that he wasn't responsible for leaking the Dyson PM text in question, but does say, "I do have some WhatsApp messages between the PM Dyson forwarded to me by the PM. I'm also happy to publish or give to the Cabinet Secretary the PM Dyson messages that I do have, which concern ventilators, bureaucracy and COVID policy, not tax issues." All the more interesting, given that the Prime Minister at PMQs indicated that his text with Dyson might be published in full, but they haven't been. But this wasn't the only area dissected by Cummings, far from it. The Number 10 story suggested that Cummings had leaked the news of a lockdown last year. Cummings said that that wasn't the case. The Cabinet Secretary told the PM that the leak was neither me nor the then Director of Communications, and that all the evidence definitely leads to Henry Newman and others in that office. The PM was very upset about this. He said to me afterwards, "If Newman is confirmed as the leaker, then I will have to fire him, and this will cause me very serious problems with Carrie, as they're best friends. Perhaps we could get the Cabinet Secretary to stop the leak inquiry?" I told him that this was mad and totally unethical, that he could not possibly cancel an inquiry about a leak that affected millions of people just because it might implicate his girlfriend's friends. Downing Street tonight said that the Prime Minister had never interfered with a leak inquiry, though that isn't quite the allegation that Cummings put. Henry Newman is a former special advisor to Michael Gove and now an advisor in Number 10 and is close to Boris Johnson's fiancée, Carrie Symonds. What is Cummings hoping to achieve by all of this?
I've no reason to think Cummings is after anything other than revenge on Boris Johnson and his entire apparatus. It's part of the long story of the power struggle. It's also, I suppose, an ethics story about what politicians and ministers should and shouldn't properly do. And it's a story about how government should and shouldn't work.
And there was yet more. Boris Johnson had wanted to raise money for the refurbishment of his Number 10 Downing Street flat via Tory party donors. He has since abandoned the scheme and paid for it himself. But Cummings says this: Number 10 made accusations regarding me and leaks concerning the PM's renovation of his flat. The PM stopped speaking to me about this matter in 2020, as I told him I thought his plans to have donors secretly pay for the renovation were unethical, foolish, possibly illegal, and almost certainly broke the rules on proper disclosure of political donations if conducted in the way he intended. I refused to help him organise these payments. He concluded, "It is sad to see the PM and his office fall so far behind the standards of competence and integrity the country deserves." If you think this is all just a typical Westminster number 10 political psychodrama, then consider this. It is hard to overstate the seriousness of these accusations, whatever you think of the accuser. Dominic Cummings was Boris Johnson's right hand, and yet here he is accusing the Prime Minister of lying, of behaving without integrity, of giving thought to override official processes in his own interest, of considering something that Dominic Cummings at least believed was potentially illegal, and Cummings hints there is more to come. It was only a year ago that the Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers expended significant sums of political capital to keep Dominic Cummings in a job, and some believe significantly undermined their public health messaging into the bargain. And for what? Less than a year later, Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson seem intent on destroying each other.
If you're going to go to war with Dominic Cummings, go very heavily armed, because he will fire back. And one of his favourite sayings, I think it was originally Bismarck's, comes to mind, which is, with a gentleman and a half, with a pirate and a half. In other words, what Dominic Cummings is saying is, you fire at me, I will fire back at you double, and Downing Street will know that.
All of this ahead of the biggest set of elections before the next general election in just a fortnight's time. Perhaps none of it will break out of the bubble, but we can't know what Cummings knows and what he might yet share. It represents a deeply volatile element in an otherwise seemingly benign political environment for Boris Johnson. There's little doubt in Westminster tonight. It's war.
Lewis Goodall. Well, we did ask the government to come on tonight's programme, but they declined. Number 10 did say in a statement that at all times the government and ministers have acted in accordance with the appropriate codes of conduct and electoral law. Cabinet Office officials have been engaged and informed throughout, and official advice has been followed. They added that the PM has never interfered in a government leak inquiry. Well, in a moment we'll talk to our political panel, but first I'm joined by Lord Kerslake, former head of the Home Civil Service. Good evening, Lord Kerslake.
Good evening.
What was your reaction to Dominic Cummings' allegations?
Well, look, I've been inside and outside government for a long time, and I thought I'd lost the capacity to be surprised. I was wrong. The level of toxicity and the disregard for the proper way of doing things is quite breathtaking, and I don't think would have happened with Theresa May or indeed any other Prime Minister. This is quite extraordinary behaviour. Of course, we've only got one side of it with Dominic Cummings. But if what he says is true, then I think it is very serious indeed, and goes to the heart of the way Number 10 is working at the moment.
But you say it wouldn't have worked in Theresa May's government. You've operated at the highest levels of government. How does this compare, do you think, with other scandals?
Oh, I think it's bigger, actually, in many ways.
Is it bigger than expenses?
I think it is, actually, because it goes to the centre of government. Expenses was about a very poor behaviour by MPs and some peers. That's what it was about. This is about the way the whole government works. Does it act with integrity, honesty, and propriety? These are crucial things. And trust in government, even if you don't agree with what it does, is a precious commodity. It's absolutely at the foundation stone of good government. And if people start to believe that government doesn't act in the interest of the country, it acts in the interests of certain individuals, then I think that's a very, very serious road to go down.
Of course, Number 10 denies all impropriety, but where do you think the biggest problems could lie for Boris Johnson?
Well, as your reporter said, there could be more to come. I think that's one big issue. I think the second thing is, though, what we see in the polls, and there's some evidence of this in a Daily Mail poll today, that people may not understand the detail of these individual incidents, but they certainly get the overall message. And they can understand a situation where a former Prime Minister looks to really run a campaign of influencing government policy, where he stands to gain financially.
So,
they see big issues inside number 10 as well. And I think it all adds up to a sense of something's not quite right here. And I think that will, in the end, do damage. There's time for him to address it, but he needs to fast.
But what about the allegation the Prime Minister was trying to shut down a leak inquiry that he set up? That surely is a pretty serious allegation. Of course, they have said they have never interfered in a COVID inquiry. But, you know, what Dominic Cummings is saying, he has proof. We don't know if he's bluffing or not. We don't know what that is. But if that allegation is proved to be true, how serious could that be for Boris Johnson?
I think very serious. Of course, it will be very hard to prove either way. But I do have to say it comes to something when Dominic Cummings is the person who's concerned about propriety and ethics. That's a normal role that he has played in government. And so I have to say it rings true. We have to test it. If it proved to be true, I think it would be quite a serious issue.
Do you think there is something inherently problematic about the relationship in government now between ministers and special advisors?
I think there are some issues in the way it's operating at the moment in this government. I actually believe special advisors can be an enormously valuable asset to both civil servants and ministers when it works well. But it does require the right balance of power and a proper understanding of roles. And I think there's some evidence that that's not happening at the moment. A bit of a frauding really is going on here. Do
you think then it depends on the style of Prime Minister? You know, for example, you know, the fish rots from the head. Do you think the tone and the atmosphere is set by the Prime Minister?
No doubt the Prime Minister sets the tone. I think Theresa May, people may have challenged her on particular policies and her approach, but she was punctilious, and I think everybody believed that. And she set the tone, really, and took tough decisions when things went wrong, if you like, or people behaved badly. She took action. I think they see a very different approach from this Prime Minister, and they take their cue from that accordingly. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, the Cummings attack comes after a wave of sleaze allegations surrounding the former Prime Minister David Cameron, who, when working for the now defunct Greensill Capital, sent texts to Chancellor Rishi Sunak touting for business, and the revelation that the Health Secretary Matt Hancock had shares in a company awarded NHS contracts. So what is the cumulative effect of all this? Joining me now is Katie Balls, Deputy Political Editor of The Spectator, Polly Toynbee, columnist for The Guardian, and Tim Montgomery, former advisor to Boris Johnson. Good evening to you all. Katie Balls, first of all, do you think that Dominic Cummings has got more to come?
Yes, I mean, we know he has the Select Committee appearance next month where he said he's more than happy to dedicate as much time as is wanted by MPs. There's a change of tune to previous Select Committee appearances from Dominic Cummings. So I think we know that's going to be a blockbuster moment. But there also is a sense that I think we would not have had today's blog published had Downing Street not issued the briefings last night. But it's clear that Dominic Cummings does want to have a say on things. And I think we might get more even than just that one Select Committee appearance in terms of future interventions.
Tell me, what do you think the tone of all of this is? Is this about a man wronged who was once protected? Or is this about Boris Johnson, as we know, apparently dissing the whole idea of the vote leave contingent now? You know, he has no time for them, apparently. He'll be critical and so forth. Is there a feeling that people are literally being shut out? They're being wiped off?
Yeah, I think if we're looking at, I suppose, the intention here, I think that we've seen vote leave cast out of Downing Street effectively since late last year, when Dominic Cummings and Lee Kane left. And I think that has, although they're out of the building, it's almost as though the ghost of Dominic Cummings is large. And I think that has created issues because there's a lot of unfinished business. And ultimately, I think there's lots of ill will between the various factions. Some of him in Downing Street, some are not. But yet it still feels we're in this almost repeat civil war that breaks out every few months and not that much changes, even if it's a slightly different setting each time. It's still the core issues, really. Polly
Toynbee, I mean, the government has had a great vaccine rollout. You know, and what Boris Johnson says is that I don't think people give a monkeys about this. Is he right?
Well, I think it's certainly true that this comes at a time when Boris Johnson has been riding very high. I mean, the vaccine matters more to people than anything else. It's freedom, it's the end of lockdown. All of that has given him a huge bounce and is likely to be a bounce that takes him through these May elections too. But nevertheless, the flavour of this, I mean, it stinks. And Labour people on the doorstep are now saying they're getting it. They're hearing people talking about it. They may not know the details. But the moment Dominic Cummings' name comes into it, he is probably one of the most unpopular people in this country. They've never forgiven him for the Barnard Castle hypocrisy. And if he's coming out with all of this poison, the combination is pretty toxic. And also, it's very specific that the idea that he's attacking Boris Johnson for soliciting funds for doing up his flat, that's the kind of thing that's very graphic, and people, it really has an effect. But there's lots more to come. There are all the PPE contracts, which the civil service said so many came from special contacts from Tory MPs that they couldn't even handle them. So there's a lot more to come.
Tim Montgomery, I mean, broadly, first of all, you might have heard Sir Bob Kersley, or not, but what he did say was that this is the capacity to be bigger than the expenses scandal. What do you make of that?
I think it's far too early to say that. And despite what Polly has just said, I think Dominic Cummings is not, as she implied, Mother Teresa in the eyes of the electorate. And so this is not sort of a critic of the Prime Minister who will immediately cause Downing Street to quake at. He doesn't have much of a reputation with the public. And so I think what matters about these allegations is not yet that they've been made. I don't think that will give them legs. What matters is what he sort of threatens within the blog that he issued today, is how much proof he has of some of the allegations that he makes. And I think the thing that Downing Street should worry about is really about this refurbishment of the number 10 flat. If it looks like there has somehow been a failure to properly declare the tax implications, in particular, of that renovation, the HMRC get involved, then it becomes a problem for Downing Street. I think up to the moment, the idea that politicians often hate each other and brief against each other isn't going to surprise many voters in the land at all.
But of course, what Boris Johnson said, that he's actually absolutely paying for the whole refurbishment of the flat. But the nature of the allegation, I mean, you know, obviously this is an internecine fight, Tim, but the nature of the allegations, some of which are very serious, which, of course, and you talk about the flat being one of them, but the other one, what we were talking about, was the idea that he stopped a leak inquiry that he had ordered because it was going to be problematic. I mean, does that beggar belief? I mean, do you believe it is obviously only an allegation? We don't have proof. Is it something that you could believe?
It is something I could believe, but I could also imagine the context in which Boris Johnson said it, you know, the sort of the chaotic way that he sometimes talks. He could have sort of made it as a sort of an aside rather than necessarily a strategy. I don't think that is the thing that they should worry about. I think it is what you first talked about, Kirsty. It's been the rumour in Westminster and Whitehall for a long time is there is this view that there is a big difference between the Prime Minister's outgoings, his expenditures, and the Prime Ministerial salary. And people wonder how those two things are bridged. Now, the refurbishment of Downing Street is the first time we've had a concrete example whereby that gap between the income he gets from all of us as taxpayers and potentially the outgoings that he has sort of reached into a form that we can speculate about. I think it's the possible journalistic continued inquiry into that gap and how it's made up could be the thing that rumbles on over the next few weeks and months and really starts to dog the Boris Johnson premiership.
And we have had another development tonight in the Telegraph are reporting that Eddie Lister, previously Chief of Staff to Boris Johnson, has resigned. Katie Balls, what more do we know about the Eddie Lister story?
Yes, he's stepping down from an envoy role that he was recently given. It's quite a short time in the role. Now, the official reason is the fact that Boris Johnson is not going on his India trip anymore, given COVID, and that's the work he was doing. Eddie Lister has also been in the news due to various lobbying allegations in terms of links he has with firms. But I think overall it was the sense that he would be departing his role in government. But this is one of Boris Johnson's long-standing aides. So I think it's just another sign that when we're trying to work out who's doing what number 10, there's a lot of shifting sands right now, and it's not quite clear who the power brokers are. It's also a sign of how the lobbying scandal is affecting things.
Polly Toynbee, of course, this doesn't just taint the Tories. It affects the whole political elite. I mean, after all, we're talking about the expenses scandal. You know, that affected politicians across the board.
Indeed, because it involves peace right across the board. But this is very specifically about this government, about the chaotic conduct or misconduct inside number 10. And the sense that there is the Prime Minister with his private phone, and any chum anywhere can call him up, get a contract, get his ear, the sort of thing that Cameron was doing. There are now so many different strands of sleazy things going on that even if people are a bit vague about exactly what is Greensill, exactly why did Cameron stand to make millions and millions of pounds out of this lobbying, out of begging the Treasury, begging the Bank of England, the indignity of it, the sense that there is no wall any longer between the commercial world and lobbying of ministers. That's something that's very much to do with this government.
Tim Montgomery, just let's talk a minute about the cumulative effect. You know, we've had the PPE scandals, we had the affair with Jennifer Curry, which was more personal, we've had Greensill, we've had the Priti Patel bullying. It paints a picture of a government that's not quite on the front foot, that's not really on top of its game.
I'm not sure whether that's quite fair, and I think the overall position of this government at the moment in the opinion polls, because of the world-beating rollout of the vaccine, is a strong one and a deservedly strong one. You know, I think, a few weeks ago, Kirsty, you know better about this than most people. There were the allegations, bombshell, is the word that people use, allegations from Alex Salmond against Nicola Sturgeon. And she rode them out, partly, I think, because unfortunately, the public do have a low expectation of the ethical behaviour of politicians. What could turn public opinion is if there is evidence, particularly of taxpayers' money being misused. The expenses outrage episode taught us that, but we haven't got there yet. So yes, this is a story that I'm sure is going to rumble on and could yet cause problems for the government. But unless you have that kind of specific, tangible, understandable abuse, I don't think the panic alarm stations will be ringing in Downing Street quite yet.
But there isn't a head honcho looking at ministerial standards just now, because Sir Alex Allen resigned, Katie Balls, over the Priti Patel bullying issue. We were told we were going to get an independent advisor ministerial standards appointed. There's still no name.
Yes, and I think there's some exasperation in terms of, even when we're talking about the ministerial code and, judging behaviours, that actually not all of this is having the impact or that it should do. I think there are a few things to look for, because in terms of inquiries and holding Boris Johnson and his government to standards, we have the various Greensill inquiries. But I also think in terms of the allegations from Dominic Cummings, we know the Charities Commission is looking into various things. I think there are lots of difficult questions for number 10 to answer. It's not an easy Friday night in there, and I think they are going to having various things coming up the track, which could make life very difficult for Boris Johnson. And it might not be an immediate backlash. We know the Tories are doing very well in the polls, but ultimately the psychodrama, I think, is damaging to all sides, even if it's one person such as Dominic Cummings bearing the main brunt.
I mean, Dominic Cummings' ammunition is toxic. It will be massive. It goes right back to the Leave campaign. How they could have decided to poke this particular snake, I cannot think. I mean, they're jolly lucky that he's kept quiet until now after they fired him. It was a dangerous thing to do. This is the man who knows where all the skeletons are.
Well, Tim Montgomery, I mean, you once were the advisor to Boris Johnson. I'm sure you don't necessarily want to give him any free advice tonight, but if you were going to be so generous as to give him free advice, what would you be saying to him to do?
I think it would be addressing some of the issues that you've raised. He's got to look like he gets ahead of this issue. He can't afford not to be appointing, a ministerial advisor on ethics. And also, I think he just needs to be a little bit more collegiate as well. He needs to, he certainly needs to get rid of his personal mobile phone. I've got a history of, I campaigned for a museum of communist terror with the Prime Minister, and I've got all sorts of messages from the Prime Minister assuring me that this was going to happen. Well, we all know that there isn't a museum of communist terror in the UK, or even plans for it. He cannot continue to operate government in a way where he's dealing outside of civil service, formal structures, liaising with people. He's got to have that organisation around him, which has slowly been built since Dominic Cummings left. Downing Street is a more organised place, but it's nowhere near as organised as it should be. And really allowing the grown-ups to fully organise him properly, that's what he's got to allow to happen, and to have some more accomplished cabinet ministers at senior levels in his administration, because at the moment it's too fly, it's too amateur, it's too disorganised.
Thank you all very much indeed. Now, India has had another record day for all the wrong reasons. The most daily cases of COVID recorded and more desperate scenes outside hospitals. This morning, the director of the Wellcome Trust and senior government advisor, Sir Jeremy Farrar, told the Today programme, now is the time to act. Echoing the Director General of WHO, he said rich countries, particularly the UK and the US, need to plot a path to donating any spare vaccines they have today. He described such a move as enlightened self-interest to bring down transmission everywhere and prevent new variants that will come back to haunt us in the future. So who exactly are the haves and have-nots? And is there actually enough vaccine to go round? Our diplomatic editor, Mark Urban, is here with a global vaccine audit.
Well, Kirsty, the global vaccination picture is, of course, very uneven. The UK, with half of its population vaccinated, is making the pace. But the US is coming up fast, having reached an astounding rate of 3.5 million jabs a day. The EU has accused the English speakers of hoovering up the vaccines and exporting little. Their achievement, now averaging 20% of population across Europe, has improved lately, but has been hampered by a poor initial procurement and a certain risk aversion with the AstraZeneca vaccine. Looking forward, the EU has ordered 1.8 billion Pfizer doses for delivery over the next 2 years, much of that for export to developing countries. But when it comes to India, we see only about 8% vaccinated, with record case rates being diagnosed. And that's all the more tragic because India, through its Serum Institute, is a vaccine manufacturing superpower. It was supposed to make 1.2 billion doses of AstraZeneca, much of it for delivery to developing countries, paid for by the better off via that international programme called COVAX. As we know, the Serum Institute held back 5 million doses bound for the UK this month as its own pandemic worsened. But that's just part of the story. Production hold-ups have been the biggest factor in limiting Serum Institute deliveries. So far, it's only managed to hand over 1/5 of the doses to COVAX that it hoped to make by the end of May. Key to its current difficulties are a US export ban on vaccine ingredients and products, and not surprisingly, many in Africa think Western countries and Big Pharma could be doing better.
We call on the pharmaceutical industry to directly transfer this technology free of intellectual property barriers to low and middle income countries through either the WHO hub or the COVAX facility. And we appeal to the international community to help mobilize the $19 billion urgently required by ACT Accelerator to implement its 2021 priorities.
Now, given India's own crisis, it's hard to imagine a speedy resumption of exports, even if that American export control to India is lifted. AstraZeneca, meanwhile, has started legal proceedings against the Serum Institute for non-delivery. Which countries does this failure to supply COVAX most threaten? They range from Pakistan, which has so far received none of its promised 25 million doses, to Nigeria, which has a 9.7 million dose fewer than expected delivery, and Brazil down 8.1 million, or 89% of what it had hoped to get from COVAX by the end of May. So the vaccination of most people in the world could still easily be 18 months off, likely more. In the meantime, governments from the US to UK and indeed India will put their own interests first, with all the global risks that entails. Kirsty.
Mark, thanks very much. And just look at the front pages, and Dominic Cummings dominates the pages. First of all, the Telegraph. Cummings declares war on Prime Minister. Claim 1, friend of Carrie Simons was to blame for Downing Street leak. Claim 2, Johnson tried to quash inquiry to avoid upsetting his fiancée. Claim 3, plans to have donors pay for flat renovation were possibly illegal. The Guardian, the same. Cummings hits back with astonishing attack on the Prime Minister. And the Daily Mail, Dom's all-out war with the Prime Minister. In a devastating 1,100-word statement, Mr Cummings effectively declared war on Number 10 and turned a flamethrower on Mr Johnson and his fiancée, Carrie Simons. Well, that's all from us tonight. Have a wonderful weekend. Emily will be back on Monday. Goodbye.